The man known to history as Emperor Puyi was born on the 7th of February 1906 at the Prince Jin Mansion, one of the imperial households in Beijing, the capital of Imperial China. He was born a prince of the Qing or Manchu dynasty, which had ruled China since the middle of the 17th century. Puyi's father, Prince Chun, whose personal name was Cai Feng, was the grandson of the Daoguang Emperor, who ruled China between 1820 and 1850. When Prince Chun was born in 1883, his elder half-brother Cai Tan was already the Guangxu Emperor, though the formidable Dowager Empress Cixi had been the real power behind the throne since 1861, as regent for her son, the Tongji Emperor. In 1901, the 18-year-old Prince Chun travelled to Germany on a diplomatic mission to offer an official apology for the murder of a German diplomat, Clemens von Ketteler, during the Boxer Rebellion that had swept China since 1899. Soon after his return to China in 1902, Prince Chun married Youlan, the daughter of Ronglu, one of Dowager Empress Cixi's leading supporters at court. The couple would go on to have 5 children, of whom Puyi was the eldest. Very little is known about Youlan, who was marginalized at the imperial court. The homeland of Puyi's Aisin Gyoro clan was in the area of northeastern China, known to Westerners as Manchuria, lying between the Korean peninsula in the south and Russia to the north. The clan had initially been part of the Jurchen tribal confederation and were vassals of the Chinese Ming dynasty. But in 1616, its chieftain Nurhaci united the Jurchen tribes and proclaimed himself as Khan of the later Jin dynasty, claiming the legacy of the Jurchen Jin Empire, which ruled northern China in the 12th century. Nurhaci went on to campaign against Ming forces and established his capital in modern-day Shenyang, also known as Mukden. Following his death in 1626, his son Hung Taiji continued the conquests by incorporating Korea and Inner Mongolia into the expanded empire. In 1636, Hung Taiji adopted the name Manchu for his people and changed the name of the dynasty from Jin to Qing. He died in 1643 and was succeeded by his young son, Emperor Shunzhi. The following year, Qing armies poured through the Shanghai Pass and occupied Beijing. While the Manchus adopted many Chinese customs and retained much of the Ming administrative system, they remained a distinct ethnic group and did not intermarry extensively with the Han Chinese majority. Qing power and prestige peaked during the long reign of the Qianlong Emperor in the second half of the 18th century, at which time the dynasty exercised great power over lands as far west as Tibet and held sway over much of the South China Sea. A steep decline followed in the early 19th century, difficulties which were compounded as the European powers began interfering to a much greater extent in the Far East than they previously had. China's refusal to open more ports to British trade led to the outbreak of the First Opium War in 1839, resulting in the cession of the island of Hong Kong to Britain in 1842. A major revolt known as the Taiping Rebellion followed in 1853, while unresolved issues over the opium trade led to the Second Opium War in 1856, during which British and French troops sacked the old summer palace in Beijing. In the second half of the century, the Chinese tried to emulate the successful modernization reforms undertaken in Japan following the Meiji Restoration of 1868. Much of this centered on creating the Beiyang Fleet, commissioning ships from British and German shipyards. However, government corruption and incompetence led to the fleet's destruction by the Japanese Navy during the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, as a result of which Formosa, the name at the time for Taiwan, was lost to Japan, and the Japanese became the primary power on the Korean peninsula. The loss of Korea and Taiwan to Japan following the war was a national humiliation for China, one that encouraged opposition to the Qing government. In this context, the government, which was largely controlled throughout this time by Dowager Empress Cixi, Puyi's great-aunt, attempted some reforms to drag China into the modern era. It was too little too late in most cases, though. In 1899, the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, known colloquially as the Boxers, emerged in northern China. By 1900, they were launching attacks on railroads built by foreign companies in China that were viewed as instruments of Western imperialism and murdering Christian missionaries. The Dowager Empress was sympathetic towards the Boxers' objectives and did little to restrain them, prompting the creation of an 8-nation alliance of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the United States, Russia, and Japan to intervene to protect their colonial and imperial interests. Foreign intervention soon crushed the Boxer revolt. Following the defeat of the Boxers, the Dowager was compelled to give more concessions to the foreign powers and to begin implementing a set of reforms modeled on the Meiji Restoration in Japan. This was the context in which Puyi was born, a country in chaos and a Qing dynasty which was barely clinging on to power, as Western nations considered carving China up between them, and domestic forces battled over whether China should stick to its traditional values or modernize. In the aftermath of Guangxu's short-lived reform program, the Dowager Empress Cixi had attempted to depose him in favor of Prince Puyi, the son of a conservative prince named Duan. Since Prince Duan had been one of the most vocal supporters of the Boxers at the Qing court, the foreign powers held him responsible for the uprising and opposed Cixi's plans, enabling the Guangxu emperor to remain on the throne. Foreign influence also ensured that Prince Chun, Puyi's father, was a prominent member of the Qing court. When Puyi was born in 1906, Dowager Empress Cixi was 70 years old and had been the effective ruler of China for 45 years. She had been experiencing frequent bouts of ill health and was on her deathbed by November 1908. On the 13th of November that year, the Dowager sent word to Prince Chun's mansion and summoned 2-year-old Puyi to the Forbidden City to adopt him into the imperial lineage as the son and successor of the Guangxu emperor. The childless Guangxu was only 37 years old, and by nominating Puyi as his successor, the Dowager was seeking to influence the political situation even after she was dead. In his autobiography, Puyi describes his refusal to be taken to the palace by the eunuchs, a crisis that was only resolved when his wet nurse was given special permission to carry him to the imperial palace. Upon seeing the elderly Dowager Empress's face, the boy burst into tears again and was dismissed soon from her presence. The following day, the Guangxu Emperor died after a short illness, fueling rumors that he had been poisoned on the orders of Cixi. There would be no investigation. The Dowager Empress died herself the next day. Hence, a few months short of his third birthday, Puyi was now created as the Xuantong Emperor. Xuantong meaning proclamation of unity, a name those around the child selected in an effort to bring the nation together despite its many troubles. Puyi's coronation ceremony was held at the Forbidden City on the 2nd of December 1908. It was a cold day, and the child emperor was soon tired of all the pageantry and ritual. By the time Puyi ascended to the throne, he began to cry. Prince Chun, in a desperate effort to calm his son and avoid further unrest in front of the prostrating officials, gently reassured him. "Be patient. Everything will soon be over. It will soon be finished." The courtiers near the throne who overheard these words interpreted them as a bad omen for the longevity of the empire. The courtiers were right to be anxious, as a revolutionary movement led by Sun Yat-sen, known as the Tungmen-Hui or United League, was gaining a lot of support in southern China and amongst Chinese exiles in Japan. Although local disturbances instigated by Sun's supporters were pacified, he remained a dangerous thorn in the government's side. For the next 3 years, the emperor's father, Prince Chun, served as regent for his young son. During his regency, Prince Chun introduced constitutional reforms, including an indirectly elected National Assembly, which urged him to introduce a constitution by 1913. In May 1911, the Grand Council was replaced with an imperial cabinet, headed by the Prime Minister, Prince Qing, a distant relation of the imperial family. These reforms were broadly unsuccessful, and on the 10th of October 1911, the Tungmen-Hui organized an armed uprising in the city of Wuchang on the Yangtze River, one of the 3 cities which subsequently merged into Wuhan. The Wuchang uprising sparked the Xinhai Revolution, as uprisings against the Qing government spread across the empire. Qing armies struggled to put down the uprisings, and Prince Chun was obliged to seek assistance from General Yuan Shikai. Since 1895, Yuan had been commander of the New Army, later renamed the Beiyang Army, a military force organized and trained along Western lines. In 1898, he had vowed to support the Guangxu Emperor and the reformers in their power struggle against the conservatives, only to betray the emperor's plans to Cixi and allow the conservatives to triumph. From then on, Prince Chun had always considered Yuan a traitor and was only prevented from executing him by Yuan's allies at court, as the Beiyang army was not prepared to follow orders from any other commander. In order to save the dynasty, Prince Chun had no other choice but to recall Yuan. Yuan now exerted a high political price and demanded the offices of Prime Minister and Commander-in-Chief in return for his aid. He proceeded to defeat the revolutionaries at Hanyang before ordering his armies to stop and return to Beijing, where he forced Prince Chun to step down from his position as regent in favor of Dowager Empress Longyu, the wife of the late Guangxu Emperor. Puyi later recalled that he had a faint memory of his first and only meeting with Yuan in the presence of Dowager Empress Longyu. This time it was the two adults who were crying, while the emperor, who had just turned 6 years old, no doubt struggled to understand what was happening. The general had presented a memorial to Longyu, requesting Puyi's abdication. Otherwise, the imperial family might well be murdered as the rebellion spread. Secretly, Yuan had been negotiating with the revolutionaries and accepted an offer to become president of a new Chinese republic if he could persuade the emperor to abdicate. Dowager Empress Longyu duly proclaimed Puyi's abdication on the 12th of February 1912, and a month later, Yuan Shikai replaced Sun Yat-sen as provisional president of the republic. As part of the terms of Puyi's abdication, the new republican government granted him the Articles of Favorable Treatment, enabling him to retain his title of emperor and continue living in the Forbidden City with his court attendants. Puyi would remain in the Forbidden City for the next 12 years, living what he later described as, quote, a most aimless and purposeless life. The Republican government maintained Puyi's establishment at great expense, and Puyi continued to have over 2,000 attendants. Throughout his childhood and adolescence, Puyi had been used to everyone bowing and scraping before him, and when he ran around the palace courtyard as a boy, the court eunuchs were obliged to run after him to keep up. He developed a strong sense of his personal power and authority, and enjoyed giving orders that his retinue would follow slavishly, while punishing those who refused. In an effort to determine the extent to which his attendants would follow the instructions of the Son of Heaven, he ordered a eunuch to pick up dirt from the floor and eat it. The eunuch duly obliged, encouraging Puyi to play more practical jokes on his eunuchs by forcing them into humiliating situations. Puyi's tutors reminded him of his ethical responsibilities and to follow the example of the great emperors, but it was only his wet nurse Wang Jiao who could stop him from playing such cruel practical jokes. As the adopted son of Emperors Tongzhi and Guangxu, Puyi considered their surviving consorts as his mothers, though he felt starved of motherly affection as a child, and was rarely allowed to see his birth parents. Dowager Empress Longyu was the most prominent of Puyi's adoptive mothers, until her death in 1913, when she was succeeded by Dowager Consort Duankang, one of Guangxu's minor consorts. Puyi felt mistreated by Duankang and believed that she was modeling herself on the notorious deceased Cixi. On one occasion in 1921, after Duankang dismissed a doctor, Puyi went to her palace and accused her of being dictatorial and subverting his own authority as emperor. The Dowager Consort responded by summoning Puyi's biological mother and grandmother to her palace, and rebuked them harshly. Puyi reluctantly went to apologize to Duankang, but 2 days after the humiliation, Lady Youlan, his birth mother, took an excess of opium and killed herself. Following this incident, Duankang treated Puyi better in order to avoid him launching an investigation into his mother's death. Isolated in the Forbidden City, Puyi received a traditional education based on the Chinese classics. His chief tutor was Chun Bao-chen, a scholar and official from Fujian province who had been an opponent of Cixi and languished in obscurity until his appointment as court tutor in 1911. Puyi was interested in Chun's reminiscences of recent history and his commentaries on contemporary Chinese political developments. He often talked of the golden age of the Qing dynasty under the emperors Kangxi and Qianlong in the 18th century, which stood in such stark contrast to Puyi's fate and the state of China in the early 20th century. In March 1919, Puyi began studying English with Reginald Johnston, a Scotsman who had served as a diplomat in China for over 2 decades, during which he adopted many Chinese customs and a keen interest in Chinese philosophy and literature. In addition to teaching him English, Johnston taught the emperor all about English customs and showed him pictures of Allied planes and tanks from the First World War. Puyi became an Anglophile and gave Johnston many honors and gifts, which he proudly displayed upon his return to Britain. At Puyi's request, Johnston gave him the English name Henry, which he continued to use throughout his life. Both Chun and Johnston encouraged Puyi in the hope that the Qing Empire might be restored. The marriage of convenience between Yuan Shikai and Sun Yat-sen did not last long, and within months the two parties were once again in conflict. In 1913, Yuan demanded the National Assembly to elect him president on a permanent basis. The Qing loyalists were encouraged when Yuan began to consider the restoration of the monarchy, but when he attempted to do so in December 1915, it was by making himself the Hongxian emperor, rather than attempting to restore the old Qing dynasty. Yuan's act provoked a series of rebellions in the provinces, and on the 22nd of March 1916, the Republic was restored after just 3 months. Yuan died of illness less than 3 months later. Yuan's death created a vacuum at the center of the Chinese government as his subordinates vied for power at the head of powerful armies. The Manchu loyalists inside the Forbidden City believed that Yuan's abortive restoration of the empire was not a rejection of imperial government, but rather a rejection of Yuan as a usurper, whereas they held firm to the idea that Puyi might yet be restored as rightful emperor, now that he was considerably older. One of Yuan's subordinates, Field Marshal Jiang Shun, had remained loyal to Qing traditions and planned to restore the empire after Yuan's death. After an audience with Puyi in June 1917, Jiang Shun led his army into Beijing at the beginning of July and proclaimed the restoration of the dynasty. After consulting with his tutors, Puyi agreed to take up the throne again. Jiang Shun sought military aid from Jiang Zuolin, the military governor of Manchuria, but the message was intercepted on the way and never arrived. Duen Chi-rei, premier of the Republican government, launched the first air raid in Chinese history by sending a plane to drop 3 small bombs into the Forbidden City. These were designed to intimidate the Qing court rather than cause any significant damage, though an unfortunate eunuch was killed in the process. The following day, Duen's army was marching on the Forbidden City. On the 12th of July, the attempted restoration of Puyi was abandoned, and he abdicated for a second time. In 1921, the year Puyi turned 15, the dowager consorts began to discuss plans for his marriage. He was presented with photographs of 4 girls and asked to choose one as his wife. His first choice, the 12-year-old Wen Xiu, was opposed by dowager consort Duen Kang, and eventually he was compelled to choose Wan Rong, the daughter of a wealthy Manchu aristocrat who was a similar age. As a compromise, Puyi was allowed to take Wen Xiu as his secondary consort, polygamy being a staple of the Chinese imperial court. On the 1st of December 1922, Puyi married both Wan Rong and Wen Xiu in an elaborate ceremony paid for by the Republican government. That evening, Puyi and Wan Rong went to the bridal chamber to spend the night together, only for the emperor to abruptly leave the chamber out of panic and return to his quarters, leaving his empress behind. The incident inspired rumors among the eunuchs about the emperor's sexuality. In his memoirs, Reginald Johnston wrote that Puyi and Wan Rong often rode their bicycles together, but a eunuch in the empress's household later claimed that Puyi rarely visited his wife at night and was always in a foul mood when he left her quarters in the morning. By the 1920s, Puyi was longing to leave the Forbidden City and study abroad. This was partly motivated by considerations of his personal security, as rival warlords were taking control of the government every few years, and Puyi feared that one day someone might seize power and execute him. At the same time, Puyi had found life in the Forbidden City stifling, and was inspired by Reginald Johnston's suggestion that he should go to study at the University of Oxford in England. Whenever Puyi raised the matter with his father and the palace officials, they advised him against it, since it would mean giving up the articles of favorable treatment that had been negotiated years earlier when he abdicated, and the palace staff would face an uncertain fate. In 1921, Johnston told Puyi about the telephone. Upon learning that there was one in his father's mansion, the emperor hoped to have one installed in the Forbidden City. The officials resisted vehemently, but eventually the teenage emperor's wish was granted. Puyi remained fond of practical jokes and often used the telephone directory to ring up celebrities before hanging up without saying a word. By the summer of 1922, Puyi submitted an official request to leave the Forbidden City. When this was turned down, he plotted with his younger brother Puyi to make an escape and raise money by selling scrolls and antiques from the palace. At Johnston's suggestion, Puyi made contact with the Dutch legation, the mission of Dutch diplomats, business people and Christian missionaries in Beijing, whom he believed might facilitate his wish to leave the Forbidden City. The Dutch minister agreed to send a car to the Forbidden City on the 25th of March 1923, but 1 hour before the agreed time, Prince Chun placed the palace complex under curfew and confronted his 2 sons and asked about their intended escape. The emperor denied that he had any intention of escaping before summoning the eunuchs in a vain attempt to determine who had leaked the information. As Puyi cursed the eunuchs, Johnston advised him to reorganize the imperial household. Over the next several months, Puyi set about doing this, expelling many of the eunuchs and other officials, a process which was facilitated in June 1923 when a fire broke out in the storerooms of the Forbidden City, destroying many priceless treasures. Puyi subsequently blamed this on the eunuchs and used it as a cover for his household reforms. Puyi was soon to be expelled from the Forbidden City as a result of events in the wider country. On the morning of the 5th of November 1924, General Fang Yuxiang rebelled against his superior commander Wu Peifu and occupied Beijing. Feng replaced the palace guard with his own men and cut off the palace's communications before sending an envoy to inform Puyi that he intended to abolish the Articles of Favorable Treatment. A few hours later, Puyi and his wives were taken by car to Prince Chun's mansion. Upon arrival, Puyi informed the soldiers that he intended to live life as an ordinary citizen and that he had considered the imperial palace a prison. Despite promises from the government that they would keep him safe, Puyi and some of his senior advisors decided to seek refuge at one of the foreign legations. While Puyi was waiting for Johnston to negotiate terms at the British legation, Chen Baochun and Zheng Xiaoshu advised him to seek help at the Japanese legation in the city instead. Puyi was well received by the Japanese officials, who reunited him with his two wives and members of his household staff. After expressing a desire to go to study in Japan, he received approval from the legation authorities. In February 1925, he left the capital and moved into a house in the Japanese concession in the port city of Tianjin. In all of this, it must be borne in mind that Japan was beginning to engage in a more aggressive approach towards China at this time, and the government in Tokyo would have viewed having hold of the last Qing emperor as a tool that they might subsequently use as part of their imperial policies. Although Puyi intended his stay in Tianjin to be a brief one, he would spend the next 7 years living in the city. During this period, his advisors were split between negotiating a return to the Forbidden City and seeking international assistance to take back the throne. Puyi himself favored establishing contact with the warlords in an effort to reacquire the throne he had lost as an infant. By now he was a young man, nearing his 20th year, and he had growing ambitions. In June 1925, he secretly left the legation to meet Marshal Jiang Zuolin at his Tianjin residence. The marshal kowtowed to him and invited him to take up residence at the old imperial palace at Shenyang. The Japanese authorities warned Puyi against traveling outside the Japanese concession, and the negotiations made no real further progress. In 1928, after a short period in control of the government in Beijing, Jiang Zuolin was assassinated by the Japanese. Although Puyi was unnerved by the death of the marshal, he believed that the Japanese would not harm him. As powerful as he was, Jiang Zuolin was just a military commander, and there were plenty of those in China. As weak as he was, Puyi had been an emperor, and it would not be straightforward for the Japanese to get rid of him without alienating the Qing loyalists who remained in northern China, particularly in Manchuria, the ancient home of the Qing in the northeast of the country. During his stay in Tianjin, Puyi enjoyed greater freedoms than those he had previously enjoyed in the Forbidden City. He was treated as an honored guest in the other foreign concessions, where he was always addressed as emperor and was invited to review their troops on special occasions. He continued to have a considerable fortune after selling some valuables taken from the Forbidden City, while he also retained substantial properties in Manchuria, which had been the personal property of the Qing emperors. A large part of Puyi's expenditure was on gifts as part of his campaign to influence warlords, but he and his family also lived an extravagant lifestyle, buying cars, pianos, watches, radios, Western clothing, and other luxurious items for himself and his two wives, who competed with each other for gifts from their husband. In an attempt to prevent his expenses from getting out of control, he set a spending limit for his wives. In 1931, Wenqiu suddenly asked for a divorce. Puyi readily consented, but came to believe that Empress Wanrong had forced her out of the way. China's wider politics were in turmoil as well again during these years. In 1927, General Chiang Kai-shek, Sun Yat-sen's successor as the head of the Nationalist Party after the old leader died in 1925, launched his Northern Expedition against the warlords, a military campaign which was given its name as Chiang Kai-shek led his armies north from the south of China against the corrupt republican government of the warlords in cities like Nanjing, Shanghai, and Beijing. In June 1928, Chiang Kai-shek's subordinate General Sun Dianying desecrated and plundered the eastern mausoleum of the Qing emperors, which included the tombs of the Kangxi and Qianlong emperors, as well as the late Cixi. Puyi and the former Qing officials were furious and swore to avenge his ancestors and restore the great Qing. Puyi recognized that he could do nothing without an army, and the only military assistance he could access was Japanese. He therefore arranged for his brother, Puyi, and one of his brothers-in-law to receive military training in Japan, while he himself entered into more concerted negotiations with Tokyo about their future plans in China. Over time, Puyi developed the ambition to rule in Manchuria, and the Japanese government would soon facilitate him, even if he would never hold anything more than some ceremonial power. On the 18th of September 1931, the Japanese Kwantung Army, under the command of Shigeru Honju, invaded Manchuria. After writing to the Japanese Army Minister, Puyi met with Kenji Doihara, the representative of the Kwantung Army stationed on the Liaodong Peninsula, who invited him to leave Tianjin for Manchuria. Doihara promised Puyi that the Japanese had no territorial ambitions in Manchuria and hoped to set up an independent state for the Manchu people, whom, he argued, had been suffering there as a result of the endless Chinese civil wars and power struggles. After being promised that he would enjoy full powers as an emperor with an alliance with Japan, Puyi accepted the offer. While Puyi made arrangements to leave Tianjin, Chen Baochun and several of his other Chinese advisors were horrified and begged him to reconsider. 3 days later, an envoy from Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government based in Nanjing offered to restore Puyi to the Forbidden City under the same terms he had lived there in the 1910s and early 1920s if he desisted from his present course. The former emperor would not be dissuaded, though. Puyi left Tianjin on the 10th of November on a Japanese boat and arrived at Manchuria on the 13th. Upon his arrival there, he was surprised to find that his advisors were still negotiating with the Japanese about the political arrangements of the new Manchurian state. In February 1932, the Japanese announced that the new state of Manchukuo, or Manchu country, would be a republic with Puyi as its chief executive based in Changchun, the capital of Liaoning province. Puyi was outraged at this breaking of the terms he had agreed earlier with the Japanese, but he was convinced to accept these arrangements after being reassured that they would only be in place for a transitional period until the establishment of an imperial government. On the 8th of March, Puyi arrived at Changchun to assume his new office in the presence of the Japanese general Honju and a group of Manchurian princes. He proceeded to appoint his prime minister Zhong Xiaoshu, the official who had attempted to reform his household at the Forbidden City, and who had been one of the loudest voices calling for Puyi to seek the support of the Japanese. Although Puyi regarded the office of chief executive as a stepping stone to the restoration of the great Qing Empire, he soon discovered that his wide-ranging powers as chief executive only existed on paper. All political decisions were instead made by Japanese deputy ministers, who answered to the Kwantung Army. In August 1932, when Zhong Xiaoshu presented to Puyi an agreement with Japan, in which the Japanese would effectively have control of the Manchurian economy, Puyi recognized that this was already reality and signed the document. In September, Marshal Nobuyoshi Muto replaced Honjo as commander of the Kwantung Army, but Puyi's hopes that the new commander would be more sympathetic to his demands for real political power soon proved illusory. The Japanese invasion of Manchuria had provoked an international outcry, and the League of Nations sent a commission of inquiry chaired by Lord Victor Bulwer-Lytton to investigate the matter. In May 1932, Puyi met with the inquiry and was asked about the circumstances of his appointment as chief executive of Manchu Kuo. In his autobiography, first published in 1964, Puyi claimed that he briefly considered telling the truth and requesting asylum in Britain, but the presence of Kwantung Army officers compelled him to tell the commission what he had been instructed by the Japanese. Puyi and his advisors were encouraged when the Lytton Commission published its report in October condemning Japanese aggression and recommending Manchuria be placed under international control. However, the League of Nations was unable to enforce its recommendations. Japan withdrew from the League in March 1933 and continued to extend its authority in northern China. Chiang Kai-shek's government in China, which was more interested in fighting the Chinese Communist Party than in confronting Japan, offered little resistance in response. Later that year, Puyi sent a trusted Japanese police officer to negotiate directly with the Japanese government in Tokyo, and in October 1933, he was informed that Japan was prepared to allow him to become an emperor. An elated Puyi sent for a set of yellow dragon robes to be brought from Beijing for the coronation, only to be informed by the Japanese that he could not wear the outfit of the emperor of the Great Qing as emperor of Manchu Kuo. The Japanese were unwilling to allow this, as it might open the possibility that Puyi would try to claim the imperial title of China years later, when they had invaded the rest of China, something which was being planned for in Tokyo already. In the end, a compromise was reached, and Puyi was allowed to wear his dragon robes during a ritual before the main coronation ceremony. He would then change into a military uniform for the coronation ceremony itself. At the age of 27, he was now an emperor for the third time in his life. While Puyi's power was still limited, he was encouraged by a state visit to Japan in April 1935, during which he met with Emperor Hirohito of Japan. However, his belief that the Japanese were treating him as an equal was soon shattered when the Kwantung Army removed Zhong Xiaoshu as prime minister and installed its own candidate, Jiang Qinghui, as his successor. Zheng was not the only official loyal to Puyi who was removed from his position. Puyi was especially troubled when his brother Pujie was compelled to marry a Japanese noblewoman in April 1937. The Japanese then passed a law designating Pujie and his sons as heirs to the throne if Puyi were to remain without a son. A few years later, when Puyi was encouraged to take a Japanese consort for himself, he adamantly refused and instead chose a girl from Manchuria. On the 7th of July 1937, following the Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing, in which Japanese and Chinese forces clashed, the Japanese invaded and occupied the former Chinese imperial capital. From then onwards, Puyi's limited freedoms were even more restricted, and almost all his public activities and announcements were carried out on the advice of Kwantung army officers attached to Puyi's household. Frustrated at his lack of political power, Puyi managed his household with strict discipline and revived his practice from the Forbidden City of having his staff flogged mercilessly for the smallest of transgressions. He reflected in his autobiography that, quote, "Although powerless and without authority outside my own household, I was the absolute ruler in my own palace." During this period, Puyi took a great interest in Buddhist scriptures and adopted a vegetarian diet. In contrast to his treatment of servants, he took great pains not to harm any animal, and recalled ordering his entire family to chase away a cat pouncing on a mouse. The Japanese army had achieved lightning successes in 1937, capturing Shanghai in November and Nanjing in December, forcing Chiang Kai-shek's government to relocate to Chongqing in southwest China, which was established as the capital of the Alliance of Convenience, which now was entered into by the Chinese nationalists and communists. By 1939, Japan's initial momentum had been blunted by extended supply lines and counteroffensives by the nationalists and communists. With its armies bogged down in China, the Japanese army launched an offensive against British and Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia in 1941, in search of badly needed oil to keep their war machine running. The simultaneous attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on the 7th of December 1941 brought the United States into the Second World War. American military aid to the Chinese government further undermined Japanese prospects in China, and Japanese efforts to launch new offensives in the south were mostly unsuccessful. Following the end of the Second World War in Europe, with the occupation of Berlin by Allied forces in May 1945, the Soviet Union could turn its attention eastwards and declare war on Japan to aid its American ally. As the Russians invaded Manchuria, Puyi and his staff fled from Changchun. Following Japan's unconditional surrender on the 15th of August in the war, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki days earlier by the United States, the Japanese occupation forces intended to take Puyi to Tokyo. The day after the surrender, the former emperor and a small number of family members and attendants arrived at Shenyang, awaiting the transfer to Japan. There was no space for Puyi's wife, Empress Wanrong, and she was later captured by the Chinese and died in prison in 1946. While Puyi was awaiting the plane to take him to Tokyo, the Soviets took control of the airfield. The following day, he was placed on a Soviet plane bound for the Siberian town of Chita, where he stayed for a few months before being transferred to Khabarovsk, close to the Chinese border. Although his attendants no longer dared to address him as emperor, Puyi was generally well treated as a Soviet prisoner. He had entertained notions that since the Soviet Union had been allied to Great Britain and the United States during the Second World War, he might be allowed a comfortable exile in Britain or America. His main priority was to avoid returning to China, and he wrote directly to Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, seeking to stay permanently in the Soviet Union. While Stalin did not grant these requests, he also refused Chiang Kai-shek's demands to extradite Puyi to China. In August 1946, Puyi was sent to Tokyo to give evidence before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, and detailed his treatment by Japanese officials. He directly accused them of war crimes, but when he was asked about his own motivations for establishing contact with Japan and going to Manchuria, he perjured himself by claiming that he had been forcibly taken by the Japanese. In his autobiography, Puyi argued that he tried to understate his role out of the fear that he would face trial in China and be executed as a collaborator. During his stay in the Soviet Union, Puyi received updates about the course of the Chinese Civil War from a Chinese-language Soviet newspaper and his Russian interpreters. After evacuating Manchuria, the Soviets handed control of the region to the Communists, and General Lin Biao used the military equipment left behind to launch an offensive in central China. At first, Puyi and his fellow prisoners did not believe the reports of communist successes, but eventually recognized that the nationalists would be defeated. Puyi himself did not have any particular preference for either side, realizing that both the nationalists and communists intended to execute him if he ever returned home. On the 1st of October 1949, Mao Zedong, leader of the Chinese Communist Party, proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China at the Gate of Heavenly Peace in front of the Forbidden City in Beijing. Following negotiations between Mao and Stalin, and much to Puyi's dismay, a deal was soon brokered for the last emperor to be sent back to China. Puyi boarded a Russian train to that effect on the 31st of July 1950. Reaching the border the next day, he was transferred to a Chinese train, still convinced that he was being led to his death. The following morning, as the train stopped at Changchun, Puyi believed that his former capital would serve as the site of his public execution, only for the train to continue on its journey. When Puyi and his fellow Manchu Kuo prisoners left the train at Shenyang, the city where Hong Taiji had proclaimed the great Qing Empire more than 3 centuries earlier, his fears that he would soon meet his death were reinforced when an officer read a list of names from a piece of paper and took them away by car. Puyi relaxed slightly when informed that he and the other prisoners on the list were to be taken to the nearby city of Fushun to rest. Puyi's spirits dropped upon arrival at his new residence, a military prison officially known as the Fushun War Criminals Management Center, a facility that also held Japanese and Chinese nationalist prisoners. He was pleased to share his cell with family members, including his brother and father-in-law. They were given communist books and newspapers and instructed to study among themselves. Their hopes were encouraged when they read an article in a newspaper that suggested that the Manchu Kuo prisoners were being sent to study because the communist government had a shortage of talent and hoped to employ them. For propaganda reasons, the communist authorities had decided to pursue a program of reform and re-education for the detainees at Fushun. If the last Qing emperor could be converted to agree with communist principles, Mao and his associates believed, so could anyone else in China, or at least this is the message which they wished to present to the Chinese people. Not long afterwards, Puyi was moved into another cell and separated from his family. He had spent his whole life having people attend to him and struggled to dress himself, brush his teeth, and serve his own food. When the director of the facility reprimanded him for failing to take care of his appearance, Puyi felt humiliated. In October 1950, the detainees of the Fushun prison were moved to Harbin following developments in the Korean War that had broken out between Communist North Korea and a Western-backed South Korea. Following the initial invasion of the South by the Communist North, the United Nations had organized a military intervention led by the United States, which changed the course of the war, and by October, American forces were approaching the Yalu River on the Chinese border in North Korea, prompting the Chinese People's Liberation Army to intervene directly in support of North Korea. Puyi and his family believed that the Americans would defeat the Communists and occupy Manchuria, and that the Communist authorities would execute them once they realized all was lost. With this mindset, Puyi refused to believe reports that Chinese and North Korean armies had driven the Americans back and captured the South Korean capital of Seoul in January 1951. Though the South recaptured Seoul a few months later, the war front soon stabilized, and peace talks began, enabling Puyi to feel more secure. While at Harbin, the re-education program designed to reform Puyi and his fellow prisoners into model communist citizens gathered pace. Puyi was encouraged to write memoirs about his life and consider how he had lived. In an effort to demonstrate his desire to reform himself, Puyi took a set of Emperor Qianlong's seals from the 18th century which he had hidden in his bag after carrying them with him for many years, and presented them to the authorities as a gift to the Chinese government. The scheme backfired, since this aroused suspicions that Puyi had other hidden treasures with him, ones which he hoped to sell one day to finance a comfortable life in exile. After much hesitation, Puyi admitted that he and his followers had possession of over 400 items of jewelry and other valuable items, and apologized for keeping them secret from the prison authorities. While Puyi was praised by his jailers and his fellow cellmates for owning up to the possession of the treasures, he soon came under further pressure about his complicity in the crimes committed by the Japanese during the war. While the prisoners were primarily instructed to write about the role of the Japanese in Manchuria, some of the inmates also chose to write about Puyi and other Chinese collaborators. Puyi was subjected to intense questioning about the atrocities he had witnessed, and asked why he did not protest to the Japanese. When he expressed remorse about his crimes and mistakes, he was encouraged to be more specific. He then proceeded to set out in detail his contacts with the Japanese while in Tianjin. As the years went on, Puyi was increasingly subjected to humiliation by men who had previously exalted him as an emperor. In 1953, the prisoners began to spend 4 hours every day making cardboard boxes for pencils for a pencil factory in Harbin. Utterly unaccustomed to any form of manual labor, Puyi was by far the slowest of the group and often made mistakes which were remarked on. When the prisoners decided that they would form a production line to speed up the process, with each person carrying out a specific task, Puyi struggled to keep up with the others, and soon a stack of unfinished pencil boxes was piling up awaiting his attention. The sustained mockery from one particular inmate caused Puyi to fall ill and confined him to bed for 2 weeks, during which he recalled his childhood and cursed Cixi's decision to make him emperor so many years earlier when he was just an infant. After his recovery, he told the director that his incompetence was down to his upbringing within the palace, and at the next group self-criticism session, he shouted a series of denunciations at the imperial system until he was hoarse. In March 1954, the Re-Education Center was moved back to Fushun, where Puyi remained for the next 5 years. New investigators came to collect evidence about the extent of Manchu collaboration with Japan, and Puyi was repeatedly denounced by family members both vocally and in writing. One of the denunciations referred to a note Puyi had written back in the late summer of 1945 to the Japanese, calling on them to resist Soviet invasion to the last man, while others contrasted his sadistic beatings of his servants with his claims that he was a Buddhist and had never hurt a fly. After being presented with these comments, Puyi realized that there was nobody left who was prepared to treat him with the respect due to an emperor. When he defended himself by arguing he had acted under duress from the Japanese, he was presented with many examples of Manchurians who had bravely resisted Japanese interrogation and torture and survived the ordeal. In 1956, the officials at Fushun decided it was time for the inmates to observe the economic developments taking place in the new socialist China. Although Puyi and some others were afraid that the locals might recognize them and cause them harm, these visits usually occurred without incident. Puyi expanded his contact with the outside world when an uncle was allowed to pay him a visit to tell him of the fate of the imperial Aisin Gyoro clan. Under Chiang's nationalists, many Manchus were discriminated against and adopted Han Chinese surnames. But after the communists came to power, many of them felt they could acknowledge their true ethnic identity. The communist government had also appointed several of Puyi's relatives to various political and cultural bodies. The knowledge that many of his family members were not only alive but doing well brought Puyi to tears. Every Chinese New Year, the detainees of the Fushun Center put on plays on subjects designed to reinforce the communist worldview. Puyi had only helped with stage decorations before, but in 1957 he performed in a short play about the Suez Crisis in Egypt. In 1958, the Re-Education Center began organizing the detainees into labor groups, and Puyi was placed into the medical group with 4 others. Although he initially struggled to carry out his tasks, he was supported by the doctors at the center's clinic and gained new confidence in his abilities. In September 1959, ahead of the 10th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, Chairman Mao issued a special pardon for reformed war criminals and counter-revolutionaries. This news encouraged the detainees to be more diligent in their ideological studies in an effort to be the first ones to be released. The communist authorities decided that Puyi had genuinely been reformed and was committed to the new government. Thus, on the 4th of December 1959, after 9 years in captivity in China, Puyi received his pardon. He arrived at his native Beijing 5 days later, where he was received by family members he had not seen for decades. As he walked around Beijing to start his new life in his mid-50s, the last emperor of China felt as though he was liberated for the first time in his life. There were still many things he had to learn about the world around him. On his first visit to a barber shop, he was fascinated by a hairdryer and asked the barber whether it was used before or after the haircut. As he waited for a bus, he courteously allowed a woman to board ahead of him without being aware that she was the female conductor, who promptly closed the doors behind her, leaving him at the bus stop. While on a tour of the Forbidden City organized for the pardoned criminals, Puyi served as special tour guide and was surprised to see the palace buildings in a better state of repair than they had been when he was a child and the master of the complex. In March 1960, Puyi spent a year working part-time at the Beijing Botanical Garden. The following March, he was given a job to organize historical materials concerning the late Qing dynasty and the warlord era. All of this suited the propaganda purposes of the regime. In 1962, Puyi was chosen as the representative of the Manchu people at the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, an advisory body to the government that included representatives from outside the Communist Party. The same year, he married Li Shuxian, a 38-year-old nurse. Puyi began giving regular press conferences praising the communist government. During his spare time, he worked on his autobiography along with Li Wenda, an editor at the government's People's Publishing Bureau, who made sure that its contents were in line with the communist government's message. The book was finally published in 1964 and subsequently translated into several foreign languages, selling well owing to interest in the strange life of China's last emperor. It would eventually be adapted into the 1987 film The Last Emperor, directed by Bernardo Bertolucci, which won several Oscar awards including Best Picture and Best Director. Puyi's health soon began to decline, and he found himself regularly in hospital receiving treatment for cancer. During the Cultural Revolution in 1966, the last emperor was a prime target for the Red Guards, who were rampaging throughout the country, seeking to destroy everything that represented old China. From his hospital bed, Puyi was saved from the worst depredations by the intervention of Premier Zhou Enlai, who instructed hospital staff to treat him well and to prevent the Red Guards from gaining access to his room. He would not live much longer anyway, though. On the 17th of October 1967, Puyi died at the age of 61, after living an extraordinary life in many guises. Following his death, his cremated remains were taken to Babaoshan Revolutionary Cemetery outside Beijing, the most illustrious resting place for Chinese communist revolutionaries. In 1995, as China reformed after the Mao era, his widow Li Shuxian had his remains transferred to the Hualong Imperial Cemetery near the Western Qing tombs. Placed on the throne of the Qing Empire as an infant, Puyi's reign as emperor lasted less than 3 years when he was forced to abdicate by Yuan Shikai in 1911. He spent the next 12 years confined to the decaying splendor of the Forbidden City, experiencing a brief restoration before being driven out of the Forbidden City several years later by one of the many warlords striving for power in a war-torn China. Burning with a desire to restore his empire, as a young adult, he collaborated with the Japanese in Manchuria and realized far too late that Japanese interests were very different from his own. After the end of the Second World War, he spent 14 years in Soviet and Chinese detention, seemingly emerging as a genuine supporter of the communist cause. He had survived all the political upheavals in China during the 20th century and died in a hospital bed. Yet there is no disguising the fact that no matter how ostentatious his surroundings were, he spent most of his life as a prisoner, first of the Chinese warlords, then of the Japanese, then of the Soviets, and then of the Chinese communists. What do you think of Puyi? Was he a sadistic tyrant who considered himself superior to everyone else, and a war criminal who collaborated with Japan? Or was he a man who was mistreated throughout his whole life by the people around him, a constant prisoner in a gilded cage? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.